know if you're like me, but every now and then I make the mistake of going to the grocery store hungry. And judging by the laughter, I would say that you're like me. It's funny because I know better. I've reminded Angie, we got to make sure that if we're going to go, that it's after we've eaten dinner, because it's dangerous to go there on an empty stomach. I've told other people in my life about how they should avoid going to the grocery store hungry. I've even read articles about the science of the temptation that occurs when you go to the grocery store hungry. And yet, there I go, strolling in with an empty stomach and full of confidence. The moment those automatic doors open, it becomes like an Olympic-level temptation course. And oftentimes, I'll find myself going to the grocery store for just one thing. You know, when I was growing up, if we were ever in a store, looking at audio equipment or the car shop or something like that, I can remember my dad would always tell the clerk or whoever the salesperson was, thanks, but we're just looking, as a kind of way of getting out of being upsold something. And I will use that same mentality when I go to the grocery store, except I don't have to tell anybody, I tell it to myself. I'm just looking. I'm just looking. I'm in for paper towels, and I find myself in the freezer section. I'm just looking. 5 minutes into the grocery store, and I'm in the snack aisle having a very real spiritual battle with chips I don't need, cookies I didn't plan on, and oh yes, ice cream that I have no business buying. I mean, when you see that Grater's pint there, and you know at the bottom of it, it's just one chunk of chocolate, you can't get past it. And of course, the whole time I'm in the aisle that I shouldn't be in, I'm thinking to myself, I'm fine. I'm strong. I can resist this temptation. And I don't know if you're this bad, but there have been times I've gone into the store and I walk out with a cart full of stuff, all stuff I didn't go for, and the one thing I was sent to go to the grocery store I did not get. That is temptation. Isn't it funny how confident that we can feel walking straight into something that has so easily tripped us up before? That's the exact issue that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians 10, the chapter that we're going to land in this morning. The Corinthians themselves felt spiritually strong. We've been going through this letter, 1 Corinthians, and it's about this group of Christians that were formerly Gentiles, and they were new to the faith, and they had a lot of cultural baggage, a lot of religious baggage, and they had a lot of baggage centered around the movement upward that they wanted to achieve in their lives. And in those efforts that they make, they began to believe that they were spiritually strong, that they were spiritually confident, that because of their newfound spiritual privilege, they were untouchable to temptation. They would think to themselves, I'm good. I won't fall this time. I can handle it. And of course, in this chapter, Paul gently says to be careful. Because sometimes when you think that you are standing firm, you're actually the most vulnerable. But Paul doesn't just leave them or us, as we read this chapter this morning, with a warning. He gives us hope. And the hope is this: that perseverance isn't about our strength, it's about God's faithfulness. It's not about our strength, it's about God's faithfulness. And that faithfulness of God, that grace of God has a name. Jesus. Jesus walked into temptation in the wilderness. If you're familiar with the Gospels, when Jesus was baptized, it says that the Spirit led him into the wilderness to be tempted. He went in hungry. 40 days. Tempted by the devil. Just like, as we're about to see, the Israelites were in the wilderness. 40 years. Living on the confidence that the God whom they served had brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery with a mighty arm. But where Israel fell, Jesus stood firm. Where we fail, Jesus remains faithful. Paul, in this passage we're about to look at, isn't calling us to imitate Israel. On the contrary, he's inviting us to trust the one who succeeded where every human in history outside of Jesus has failed. As Paul says in another letter in Romans chapter 3, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, which means that all of us are in need of grace, which means that all of us are in need of mercy, which means that all of us are need the strength that Jesus and Jesus alone provides. And so Paul uses Israel's story in this chapter in the first 4 verses because the Corinthians had begun to believe their spiritual experiences made them untouchable to temptation. And Israel's wilderness failures show how dangerous that mindset can be. So I want to invite you to pick up in verse 5 of chapter 10. We're going to read through verse 13 and see what Paul tries to teach the Corinthians using the backdrop of the story of the Israelites in the wilderness in the book of Exodus. This is what Paul writes. It says, "Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happen as a warning to us so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure." Now, Paul reminds the Corinthians that the Israelites had every spiritual advantage. They experienced God's presence in the cloud. They experienced the parting of the sea where they walked out to freedom under the captivity of the Egyptians. They experienced bread or manna coming down from heaven to nourish their bodies. And when they were thirsty, they received water from the rock. They saw God's hand at work constantly at every twist and turn in their journey in the wilderness. But Paul is basically saying that Israel had their own versions of the things that you Christians rely on. Those of us that are Christians, we have our baptism moments. We have our powerful experiences where we know that God has been at work in our lives. We have spiritual milestones that we remember and we tell the stories in our own testimonies. And even that wasn't able to keep them faithful. Today we would say things like they had their conferences, their camps, their worship nights, their miracles, their highlight reels, their mountaintop experiences. They've seen it all and experienced it all, and yet spiritual privilege that they had didn't equal perseverance in the faith. So again, Paul says in verse 5, to repeat it here, it says, "Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness." Paul doesn't say this because God loves judgment, although God does judge in the end, but because spiritual experiences don't equate to spiritual endurance. And endurance and perseverance is one of the major themes in the entirety of the New Testament. We are not only called to enter the faith, but we are meant to persist in it, in day-to-day life, in the highs, the lows, and the challenges that we face. We are called to stick with Jesus to the very end. But only Jesus had the spiritual privilege and perfect perseverance. And he didn't use his privilege to avoid temptation, but he used it to walk faithfully for us. He experienced the temptation, but he didn't succumb to sin. He remained sinless and spotless so that he could lay down his life for our sake. Our hope isn't in our spiritual moments or highlight reels. Our hope is in Christ's faithful record. Our hope is in him alone, not in our strength, not in our might, but his. So then Paul walks through Israel's failures, not to shame them, but to show the pattern we all have the tendency to fall into. These failures didn't come out of nowhere. They came in their lives from a slow drift in trust as Israel moved through the wilderness. They began on their way to crave, wanting something other than God to testify or to satisfy. They began to succumb to idolatry, turning good things into ultimate things to be worshiped. They turned to sexual immorality, reaching for comfort and validation in worldly pleasure rather than in the delight of God. They began to test God in their grumbling, asking God, "Why aren't you doing what I want you to do, in the way that I want you to do it, in the timing that I want you to do it?" And they began grumbling, withdrawing their trust and faithfulness to God, and instead blaming God for their circumstances as they trudged in the desert wilderness. And Paul's point here is not, look at how terrible they were. That's easy to do. We read back in these stories and we think, man, they really missed it. They got to see all this good stuff, experience all this good stuff, and then they went off the track. And yet the truth is that we just as easily can succumb to this. His point is that this is what happens when people who know God think they are untouchable to temptation. And this is why we need Jesus. He was the only one who was truly untouchable, and yet chose the wilderness, chose humility, and chose obedience to the Father. Where Israel failed, where we all fail, where I fail, where you fail, Jesus remained faithful. And Paul doesn't say, try harder like Israel. Instead, he says, in every moment of your life, trust deeper in Christ. Don't try harder. Don't will your way into it. Trust in the one who is trustworthy. And then Paul writes in verse 12, he says, if you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. We've all heard the saying, pride comes before the fall. Not because God is waiting to punish us, just waiting for us to trip up, but because overconfidence blinds us to our faults, our temptations. It blinds us to the warning signs and it lures us into old patterns. It convinces us that we can handle the moment, that that moment won't affect me, that that situation is fine to walk right into. I'm good, I'll remain good. But Jesus doesn't ask us to be superhuman, to exercise a will that we don't have. He asks us instead to be honest about our frailty and our failings and to come to him. Perseverance starts with his grace, not our strength. And let's be honest, All of us have had moments in life where it's harder than we expected it to be, where faith feels thinner than we had hoped. We might tell ourselves that we have more faith than we actually have, and where we realize we're not as strong as we believed. And it's at that moment when we're considering the failings of the Israelites and considering our own frailty that Paul shifts in that final verse to a word of hope. He says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, again, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out. Now in the Greek here, the word that Paul is using here for testing or temptation, it carries this idea of being pressured or being stretched. Like Israel in the wilderness, and like Jesus when he was in the wilderness being tempted by the devil. But we need to clear up a big misconception here, because this verse is also often misquoted, misapplied, or misunderstood. I have often seen over the years as a pastor someone going through a difficult time, maybe grief, maybe they lost a job, maybe they missed out on that promotion, maybe they've had a severed relationship, and someone will quote this passage to them in a way that misunderstands what Paul's saying. They'll say something like, God won't give you more than you can handle. But that is not what Paul is talking about here. Life absolutely gives us more than we can handle. If you're human, life has given you more than you can handle. I see people all the time who are taking on more than they can handle. Their shoulders are stacked to the deck of busyness of life. People going through endless griefs. It feels like they suffer one loss after the other. And Paul would never come in and say, hey, turn that frown upside down because God will never give you more than you can handle. Instead, Paul isn't talking about suffering at all here. He's talking about temptation. He's saying you'll never face a temptation that someone else hasn't faced. You'll never face a temptation where God abandons you, and you'll never face a temptation without a faithful path out and onward. Ever. And that path forward is not based on your strength. It's based on the strength and faithfulness of Jesus. Jesus is the way out. Jesus is the presence in the wilderness. Jesus is the strength when ours runs out. Sometimes the way out might be an escape plan, but oftentimes the way out is Jesus-reliant endurance. And the strength to stay standing when everything in you wants to give in. And even when we look for loopholes instead of escape, God remains faithful. That's why our bottom line today is this. Spiritual privilege doesn't guarantee perseverance, but God's faithfulness will carry you when your strength can't. And I promise you, if you're living on this earth, there will be times, and you may be going through them right now, where your strength can't get the job done. For the disappointed, you hope that something that didn't happen wouldn't happen. But the temptation is to shut down, to pull back, to grow cynical, to say, I can't walk anymore. But Paul reminds us that God is faithful, and he's not finished with you, and that he still has more for you to do in this life and in faith. For those facing temptation, maybe you're one of those people, you've overcome something, you've overcome years of a sin habit, and you think that's been put in the past, I'll never deal with it again. You ought to be past these certain struggles, you tell yourself, and now you're standing in old territory again. The weight of the world is crushing in, and you just want to go back to that one thing that gives you a moment of comfort, even though it'll cause you to slip back into your own demise. Paul says there's always a way out and a way forward. For the grieving, life changed faster than you could process. You weren't ready for that loss. You weren't ready for that failing, and you wonder if your faith is even working. You think to yourself, maybe I haven't prayed hard enough, or I haven't prayed the right words. But that's not how God works. Paul says you're not holding on to God nearly as tightly as he's holding on to you. You don't have to be the strong one in faith. In fact, Jesus tells his own disciples that the faith required is the faith of a tiny mustard seed. More faith doesn't get the job done. More faithfulness of God comes to your rescue. And for the exhausted, parents pouring out every last drop, empty nesters wondering about their purpose, students who are buried in pressure about life decisions, about relationships, about the difficulties of navigating everything in your life and feeling like you've got to have all the answers before you even hit graduation day. I've got good news. God will provide you what you need, not once you're stronger, but right here in your weakness, right where you are right now. For those pretending to be strong, for those putting on the smile when they're in pain, for those pretending like they have to have a faith that surpasses all, you don't have to. Perseverance doesn't come from pretending. It comes from depending on God. And so we ask ourselves, where am I relying on my strength instead of God's faithfulness? Where do I feel close to falling and need God's way forward? Where is Jesus inviting me to trust deeper rather than trying harder? I hit a season like that in my life around and in the year 2014. That was a year where all the stuff that I learned in seminary, I suddenly realized wasn't going to get the job done. That's the running joke. After you graduate Bible college and go to the ministry, we always ask ourselves, so is this the stuff that you couldn't learn in the classroom? That's when things got real for me. Everything seemed to hit all at once, personally, pastorally, and emotionally. I had already been a part of conducting funerals, but in and around that year, I lost two people that were really, really close friends. And all of a sudden, I wasn't there to be a steady rock. I realized how frail and how unsteady I really was. I had to put on a brave face, and I'd find myself 2 weeks after the funeral breaking down in tears in my car because I couldn't let go of the one that I lost. Angie and I had to walk two very close friends that we thought we'd be friends with forever through separation and then divorce. You always hear about the hardships people face, but you say, not my friend group, until it becomes your friend group. I had a ministry transition that I had been promised that looked like it was going to go through in that year, and then all of a sudden the rug got pulled out from under me. Up to that point in ministry, I believed that my job as a minister was to fix things, to fix situations, to fix emotions, to fix people. And in that season, the illusion unraveled from me. I hit a wall. I started counseling for the first time that year. And for the first time in my life, I had to admit, I can't push through this. I don't have enough faith to keep me going. And I think that was the moment in my life that God finally had room to whisper, good. Now you can let me carry you. I didn't feel strong, but I learned that God was strong in his faithfulness. I didn't feel like I was persevering, but I learned God was holding me. And that truth has carried me through every hard season I've faced since then. God used the hard season to toughen me up. Paul's warning in 1 Corinthians 10 isn't meant to scare us. It's meant to steady us. but not in our own strength, because the same God who walked with Israel walks with you. The same Jesus who stood in the wilderness facing his own temptation stands with you in yours. And the same Spirit who sustained Paul sustains you today. You may not feel strong, but God is faithful. And in his faithfulness, he will carry you. Now, in that year, 2014, I had a friend named Gail who was also a counselor, and she was on staff with us at the church. And in low moments, sometimes I just go pick her brain on, hey, how do I navigate through these things? And being wired the way that I am, I'm always thinking ahead, and I wish I could say I'm always thinking ahead to the better possibilities, but I'm normally thinking ahead to what the worst outcomes might be. And one thing that she taught me was to stay grounded in the moment, to recognize that God is always present with me, and to be able to say to myself that because of him, I am safe now. And when she said that, I thought back to a song I'd heard a few years before. It's a Phil Wickham song, and it's called Safe. And I held on to that song. I don't know how many times I'd be driving in the car singing it. I'd be sitting at home humming it in my head, just contemplating the lyrics. It reminded me that even when I didn't feel strong, God was still holding me. And the same God who carried me then is carrying you now. You don't have to pretend to be strong. You don't have to hold everything together. So I thought, instead of just telling you about the song, I'd just let you hear it this morning. And as you listen to the words, let it be a moment where you can reflect. A reminder that no matter what season you're in, you are safe in him. Because perseverance isn't about our strength. It's about God's faithfulness.